welcome back to Honest Straightforward Reviews. I have been out of it for a little bit, haven't been doing much on the channel just because of life and what it's throwing at me. However, I've been meaning to do this for a while. I've gotten all the results, I've compiled them together, and I just had to make this video. Now, this is a video realistically looking at the capabilities of the 9800X 3D. I've gone out and spent a lot of my own funds to be able to do this for you guys. I hope you guys appreciate it, and let's get this underway. Now, the 9800X 3D, what I've done is I've put it up against the previous two generations of X3Ds of the same class. I've also gotten the latest and greatest 9950X, okay, so a lot of money there. I've also got a Core Ultra 7 and Ultra 9, and you guys got to appreciate I have to change the RAMs, I have to change all sort of things, the motherboard at least, you know, in some cases the power supply as well. Now let's get this test underway. What I would like to do is do a system setup. So I have all of these processors have been paired up with graphic cards of the same architecture. So we have the PNY RTX 4090, and this is the cheapest version one, the Verto. They have a XLR8, which is an accelerate version, which is overclocked a tiny bit. So, but on the 4090s, especially with the 40 series GPUs, there wasn't much in the overclocking. They've been slowly taking it out. So let's look at Zen 3. So your Zen 3 would be your 5800X 3D, which I'm still rocking on my personal system, and the specs you have here is for my personal system. So I have a X570 Aorus Master, the system that I use. I have a 400 megahertz RAM, okay, and it's a CL18, and there's 2 sticks of 32 gigs. Now the reason I'm using 4000, I do know Corsair does 4600, but from my understanding, Ryzen, especially the Zen 3 architecture, they have an issue of the Infinity fabric, and that prefers the megahertz to be between about 3600 to 4000. Correct me if I'm wrong, please do comment below. If you have more information about that, I'll really appreciate it. Now the cooler I'm using on these are exactly the same, which is the EKAIO, and it is a 360mm, okay? They're different ones, but like they're all 360 and they're all EKAIOs, and one of them isn't a DRGB. Anyways, I have 9 Arctic fans in there for all of them to make it the same. And what I've done is I've used the Thermal Grizzly Cryonaut paste, okay? So this is the paste that's used between the cooler and the CPU. So that's the setup that I'm using, okay? So for Zen 4 and Zen 5, what I've done is I've used the latest and greatest, which is at the moment, at the time of this video. So don't comment 2 years later. Please look at what time I made this video. So it's a X870E Aorus Master, and that is with 6000 megahertz, but a higher CL of 32, and that's only 16 gigs of 2 sticks of 16, but that's 32 gigs. That's more than enough. And I have, for the Arrow Lake, I have a Asus Z890 Maximus Hero, okay, with the same RAMs as before. All right, let's get this underway. Now you'll be looking, I've been forced to do the pricing in USD this time around because everyone, I guess, looks at it from the US point of view. So this is the first time I'm doing this in the channel. So if you're a returning HSR subscriber and you're thinking, hey, what's going on here? That's the reason. So normally I would do Aussie dollars. So I'm still going to do Aussie dollars in regards to what you can do for the pricing right now, because I'm in Australia and I'll have a look at the market and how much you can get it for. Anyways, let's get this started. So the 9800X 3D starts at $450. So that's quite a bit of a hefty price. The previous generation you can get it for 450, and the 5800X3D has dropped down to 340. Now the Core Ultra 7 is at 395, the Core Ultra 9 is at 590, and the 9950X is at $600, a whopping 600 USD. Now let's look at the L3 cache. For the X3Ds, they have the same 96 megabytes of L3 cache. The Core Ultra 7 has 30, Ultra 9 has 36, and interestingly the 9950X has 64 megabytes. Looking at the architecture, obviously you've got the 9800X3D at 4 nanometer, 7800X3D at 5 nanometer, and the 5800X3D at 7 nanometer. Both the Intel CPUs are at 3 nanometer, which is the latest and greatest at the moment, and the 9950X again is at 4 nanometers. Now looking at the core count, going through the CPUs without saying it ascending, so 4700 megahertz, 4200 megahertz, 3400 megahertz, 39 and 3300 megahertz. And the reason for that having is because it's got your efficiency cores, and then you have your performance cores. And for the Ultra 9 you have 37 to 3200, and for the last one, the 9950X, you have 4300 megahertz, which is quite high, especially when you compare it to the 5800X3D at 3400. Let's look at the boost clocks. So boost is 5200 megahertz for the latest 9800X3D. For the 7800X3D, it's 5000 megahertz, so a nice little bump there. And for the 5800X3D is 4500 megahertz. So, and I can report really easily. Mine never does that. I've got a water cooler on there. It's done the right way. It's done really well. I have done everything. I've undervolted it as well at different undervolts and pushed it a tiny bit. The maximum I am able to get is about 4400 megahertz out of it, give or take 100. Your scenario might differ depending on your silicon you get. The Ultra 7 goes up to 55 and 4600 megahertz, which is quite impressive. The Ultra 9 goes to 57 and 4600 megahertz. And then lastly you have the 9950X at 5200 megahertz. The TDP is 120 for the two 3DXs, the latest two 3DXs. The 5800X3D is at 105. Both the Intel offerings are at 250, and the 9950X is 170 watts. Looking at the core and thread counts, we have the 3DXs at all the same as 8 and 16. We have the Ultra 7 at 8 plus 12, and that's being 8 efficiency and 12 performance, and you have your 20 cores in total. And you have your Ultra at 8 and 16 with 24 in total. Then you have your 16 and 32 for the 9950X. Moving on to the fan noise relative to temperature. So basically making sure the temperature is the same. And what I've done is I've set the 9800X3D as the base, so it's 100%, and anything behind it or doing above it, it'll be more than the 100%. Okay, stick with me, it might make more sense if it doesn't now. So looking at the CPUs at idle, the power usage for them, the 9800X3D is at 78 watts, 7800X3D is at 84, the 5800X3D is a nice 61 watts. The Ultra 9 and 7, they're at 58 and 57, and lastly the 9950X is at 80 watts. Now looking at gaming, you have your 9800 at 62, you have the 7800 at 71, you have the 5800 at 66, you have the Ultra 9 at 60, you have the Core 7 at 49, and you have the 9950 at 60 9. What was impressive for myself was seeing the Core Ultra 7 perform quite cool under load with gaming, and I was quite impressed by this. So I've done a few games and I wanted to just get a comparison. Moving on to power usage, so the 9800 was using 65 watts, the 7800 was using 46 watts. Let's look at the last slide. You can look at the rest yourself in regards to the wattage. Let's look at the last slide. We have the performance of the 9800X3D as the benchmark, so saying 100%. The 7800X3D was about 14% behind it. The 5800X3D was about 30% behind it. The Core 9 is 23% ahead. The Core Ultra 7 is 15% ahead. And lastly, the 9950 was the leader at 27% ahead of it. Let's get some of the testing started. So the AI stuff, I wanted to include this as a new slide. I know it's mostly reliant on the NVIDIA GPUs these days. However, you do have some CPU playing into it. Now, first of all, I have the Flux 1 Dev version. So this is to just generate some images, and I've done that in Stable Diffusion Forge, which is quite updated and you can run it in there. Although I do personally prefer the Comfy UI version, but I just did it for this. So looking at that, this is how long it took to render each image based on your CPU. So you have the 9800X3D out of the X3Ds being the fastest, so the lower the better. And however, it's been beaten by the Core Ultra at 98 seconds, followed closely by the Core Ultra 7 at 100 seconds and the 9950X at 114. So realistically, the Intel chips have this. They're better paired with the NVIDIA. Going for Flux in Forge, going at AI upscaling, so I use this app called Topaz. They do a few things, but AI upscaling is one of it. And using that, the lower is better. You have both the 9800X3D and 9950X at the highest end, which is just 7 seconds. You have at the lowest end where it's really struggling compared to these two CPUs is the 5800X3D at 20 seconds and the Core Ultra 7, which was disappointing at 16 seconds. Now, looking at some large language model, so I use Mistral for this, and Mistral running it on the large language model, again, the Intel CPUs did a lot better. They were at 89 and 92, and then you were followed by the 9950X and then the 9800X3D, but there was quite a big difference between them. Looking at some unzipping and compression and decompression, and I was using 7-Zip, which is a free app you can download to zip stuff and unzip them. So looking at compression, we have this is the score, so it's not the time, so the higher is better. So we have the Ultra topping out at 203, okay, and decompression, again, you have the Ultra at quite good, which is 212. However, it's beaten out by the 9950X at 274. Okay, after that, again, the Intel Core Ultra 7 is good over there, and then you have the X3Ds coming in with the 5800X3D being at the bottom. Looking at Cinebench 2024, you have the single core score, and the higher the score, the better. We're looking at the Core Ultra 9 at the top, and that is followed by the 9950X with 9-point difference, then the Ultra 7, and then you have the 3DXs in line how they should be. I'll only go through and break down the 3DXs if there's something out of the ordinary that happens. For example, let's say the 7800X3D outperforms the 9800X3D. Otherwise, I'll just say it was followed off by these, and just as you can assume that the 9800X3D was the first one, then it was followed by the 7800X3D and the 5800X3D. Looking at multi-core, so multi-core is interesting again. You have again the Core Ultra 9 up there, followed closely by the 9950X, the Ultra 7, and disappointingly the 9800X3D here suffers quite a bit. It's nearly half the score of the top performers, and then you have the rest of them. The next benchmark I have for you guys is Blender, and I'm running Monster in here. I used to do a lot more, but I'm just doing Monster for this one. As you can appreciate, the resource this took has just cost me so much time and also funds. So if you appreciate this, please do like, subscribe. I'm a tiny channel. I try to bring these to you as unbiased and as much as I can without errors. Please do comment below if you find anything to help out the channel. You can tip if you can, that'll be great as well. Now, looking at the Monster benchmark, the higher the score is, the better. You have both the high-end CPUs by Intel and AMD up top at 271 with the 9950X and Ultra 9, followed closely by the Ultra 7. However, the 9800X3D is quite again halfway, and then it's followed by the rest of them. The next benchmark I have is for something which is very CPU intensive. So gaming emulators, they're very CPU intensive. So I have two emulators. One is Ryzen and the other one is RPCS3. Now the RPCS3, that runs the emulator for PlayStation, the other one does it for Switch. So let's look at Rocket League first. Surprisingly, as soon as you go into gaming, the 9800X3D does quite well, followed closely by the 7800X3D. There's not much between the 7800X3D and the 9950X. They're quite on par. Then you have the rest, the 5800X3D and the Ultra 9. They're basically about the same, and the Core Ultra 7 is there as well at the end, at the bottom. Now looking at the Last of Us on PS emulator, and we have the Ultra 9. Interestingly, the Ultra 9 X3D and the 9950X on party. You have the 7800X3D closely behind with the Ultra 7, and last and quite a bit behind everyone is the 5800X3D at 34 frames. Let's move on to encoding. So encoding is when you render stuff and then it takes the time from for you to export that. So the lower the time, the better. So first of all, just encoding MP3, you have the 9950X at a nice 26 seconds, followed by the 9800X3D at 30, and you have, as usual by now, you have the 5800X3D at the bottom. Looking at HEVC, which is what I deal with for all my YouTube videos. So if you don't know what HEVC is, so MP3 is audio, HEVC is video, and it just is the level of compression. So it's really good, makes really small files, so I can upload them easily onto YouTube. So here you have the 9950X doing really well at 38 seconds, but it's margin of error with Ultra 9, which beats it by 1 second. You have the Ultra 7 then following with 43 seconds. Then you have the X3Ds. However, they're quite far behind. Looking at AV1, which is a new format, and looking at that, you have the Ultra 9 topping out, followed by the Ultra 7, and disappointingly the 9950X after the Ultra 7, and then you have your X3Ds. Let's look at a Puget benchmark. So this is in Adobe Photoshop, and you have media, so the higher the score the better. So you have the Ultra 9 up there, followed by the 9950 and the Ultra 7, then the X3Ds. And if you look at it overall score, the 19800 X3D does marvelously well at the top with 12449, followed by the 9950X, the 7800 X3D, and at the bottom you have the 5800 X3D. Let's get into gaming benchmarks, which is what you're here for, and I'm glad that you are here, and I'm pleased to announce to you guys that I'll be doing both RT and non-RT for some of the games, and I have included the 1% lows for everything that is here. So that should really help out with getting a full understanding of what these CPUs are capable of. So starting off, we have, this is where the 9800 X3D, as most of you are aware, would outshine everything. So if you are new to the CPU game, the X3D versions are the gaming versions of AMD. So AMD introduced these with more L cache and L3 cache in particular, and what that means is L3 cache in short is used by gaming. It relies on it a lot to load stuff, so it's very useful. That's why it outshines everyone, and the frames are absolutely marvelous at 660, and the closest normal CPU that comes at it is 9950X at 515. Now looking at the 1% low, it does quite well as well. It's leading everyone, and the X3Ds lead everyone in the 1% lows. However, the 5800 X3D comes at the bottom, but not by much, surprisingly. It's doing quite well for its age and how old it is when it comes to gaming. But if you're getting, so far it looks like if you're looking at a 9800 X3D from a 5800 X3D, it looks okay, you know, from all the benchmarks. But if you're getting an X3D, you're getting it for gaming. So realistically, you should be looking at this from here on. If you're more reliant on other things and gaming is on the side, then the 9950X or the Core Ultra 9 would be good options for you to look at as well. So depending where you're coming at this from, so those are your options. So this is, and to also magnify, what I've done in a bit different in this test is to magnify the results. I've included 1080p for most of the games. Looking at 2K, you can see immediately they all kind of balance out, and there's not much in there. 2K is where I feel comfortable and I game at, and I think there's not much of a difference between 2K and 4K, but a massive difference between 2K and full HD, especially at the distance I game at. For me to see the benefit of 4K, I need to be quite close to my monitor, which I'm not comfortable at. However, having said how the average FPS is about the same, you do see a massive difference in the 1% lows, especially looking at the 9800 X3D and the 7800 X3D, and then looking at the 5800 X3D, there's almost a 41 frame difference between the lowest to the highest. Looking at 2K, they are on par, and again the only differences you'll see is in the 1% low, where the Intel variants struggle right down the bottom. Looking at Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p, you have again the 5800 X3D leading with everything with their 1% lows, and the Intel variants being at the bottom. But what was surprising for me is to see that the 5800 X3D for gaming, 5800 X3D, which is quite old by now, is beating the 9950. Now, before I get into the 2K for Cyberpunk 2077, I would like to apologize. I had issues with my system and it didn't record the 1% low, so I didn't want to stuff things up and redo everything with different drivers, and then I have to do the whole test again. I left it out, so apologies for not having it, but looking at the other results from before, they're going to be about the same. So again, they taper off, they're about the same, margin of error difference, but the difference that can be seen is the 1% low, which is not much, but it's still there. Looking at 2K, everything is the same. There's hardly any differences, a frame here or there, even at the 1% lows. But the Ultra is struggling, in my opinion, when it comes to 1% lows in gaming especially. Next game I have for you guys is The Last of Us at full HD. Again, we have the 9800X3D right up top with everything. It's beating everything. It's really the king. It's really improved. It's great to see, but not much of a difference between the 9800X3D and the 7800X3D. When you go to 2K again, there's hardly any differences in there. There's hardly any differences in the 1% lows even between the 3DXs, but the Intel ones are a bit lower. Looking at 2K, again, the Intel ones are struggling, but there's nothing there for the AMD offerings when you look at the Last of Us 2K. Okay, the next game I have for you guys is Star Wars Jedi Survivor at full HD. Again, there is no catching the 9800X3D when you're gaming. If you're deciding to game at full HD, it does really well. It beats everything by far. And surprisingly here for myself at 2K, there was a massive improvement. The 5800X3D was beating all the newer normal CPUs, so the Ultra 9, 7 and the 5800X3D. Although its 1% low wasn't as good as the Ultra 7s, okay, but as soon as you went off to the 7800X3D and the 9800X3D at 2K, they really improved, especially looking at the 9800X3D just for this game, just at 2K. It had a massive improvement of over 60 frames and over nearly again 60 frames for the 1% lows. So that is very, very impressive. However, as soon as you moved from 2K to 4K, there's not much difference, even with the 950X. So yes, the 9800X3D is fantastic for gaming, but only I feel like so far from the benchmarks at full HD, except for this game at 2K. But when you go to 4K, you might as well go the 9950X. So because it's got that extra bit of oomph for when you're doing processing, and if you do any sort of, if you run your YouTube channel or whatever, it is quite good. Next game is Homelands 3. We have the king of the gaming CPUs up there at the 9800X3D. You have the 9950X doing better than the 5800X3D here, but the Intel offerings are again below par. When we go to Homeworld 3 2K, again we see a massive difference here, which is nice to see. Going to 4K, that difference is still there. So this CPU does do well when it comes to gaming. However, when you're comparing that against something like the 5800X3D, there is not much in there between 50 and 48. But what I would like to really point out to you guys is the 1% low. The 1% low is really improved here between 18 and 36. So 1% of the time the game drops down to 18 frames per second. So that stutter is really noticeable between in 30 frames for the 5800X3D. However, that difference is it is still noticeable, but it's not as big between 14 frames for the 9800X3D. Looking at Alan Wake, to my surprise, this is my, by the way, first game that I've done ray tracing on this benchmark for you guys. When I turned on ray tracing at 1080, there's hardly anything in there except for the 1% lows. The Intel variants really struggled. The 5800X3D does quite well, but nowhere as well as the 9800X3D. Moving on to 2K, and everything just balances out, all the 1% lows and everything like that. And again, this is ray tracing now we're looking at. But when you go to 4K, something interesting happens. The average is all about the same between a frame here and there. However, the 1% lows, again, the 9800X3D does quite well, especially against the 5800X3D. There's not much between the 9800 and 7800 when it comes to those 1% lows so far that I'm seeing. When we go to Spider-Man Remastered with ray tracing on, you see again the 9800 X3D doing quite well. However, you're looking at the Core Ultra 9 here, they have finally pulled up the game and they've come up a bit, so they're doing quite well for this, but the 5800 X3D is quite far behind. At 2K, we see the same sort of scenario where everything is beneath the 5800 X3D in the 1% lows or the FPS. So it does really well in this game with ray tracing. With ray tracing on, when we go to 4K, we still see a 8 frame improvement over the 5800 X3D, and the 9950X is in between the 9800 X3D and the 5800 X3D, and the 1% lows, interestingly, is not too far behind. The Intel variants are doing good, but the 1% low is a tiny bit lower than the AMD variants. Next game I have for you guys is Elden Ring, ray tracing enabled, and again, not much here except for the 1% lows. The Intel variants really struggle with the Ultra 7 at 28. That's going to be really difficult with that sort of frame rates. Looking at 2K, improvement, again the Intel variants are lower, but everything kind of balances out between the 1% lows and the averages. Going at 4K, Elden Ring, ray tracing turned on, everything is on parity between the X3Ds. They're performing basically the same as one another. Looking at Cyberpunk, so the reason we're looking at it again is this version is going to be with ray tracing turned on. So with ray tracing turned on, again it kind of balances things out a bit, but the 1% lows are the place to look at. When you look at 2K, they start, the 5800 X3D starts catching up, and at 4K they're basically all the same, except for the Intel variants are struggling a tiny bit in the 1% low department. Go on to the 9 game average. First slide that I have for you guys is for the full HD. Okay, so full HD, we can see the 9800 X3D leading the mark by a massive average of 218 and an impressive 1% low of 135. Looking at the 7800 X3D, that is at 199 with still an impressive 121, and I'm not too disappointed at all with the 5800 X3D at 168 average with 100 average for the 1% lows. This is much better performance on an average compared to the Ultra 9 and Ultra 7 put together. The Ultra 9 struggles at 158 with a 95 1% low, and the Ultra 7 is 166, just below the 5800 X3D, and with a 1% low of 91, which is quite low compared to the 5800 X3D, which is like 2 generation old CPU. This is Intel's latest and greatest. Going on to the 19950X, that is the least impressive when looking at gaming for full HD at 134 frames with a 102 1% low. The 1% low is not too bad, however the average FPS is by far the lowest. Going on to 2K gaming, this is where you'll start seeing everything average off. The reason I put the 1080p in there is just again for comparison, really pushing it, bounding it by the CPU and seeing what the CPU can do. Now we're going towards more GPU bound. So looking at GPU bound, we have the latest X3Ds up top at 144 average and 143 average between the 9800X3D and 7800X3D. The only thing that really picks them apart is the 98 average 1% lows and the 93, which makes the 9800X3D a bit better. The 5800X3D here struggles a bit, behind by 132 and 81, but just before above it is 134 for the Ultra 9 and Ultra 7, and 82 and 83 for them for the 1% lows. The 9950X 133 and 82. Now looking at 2K, this is where we start talking about games. I think from what it looks like, the 5800X3D, yes, is a improvement, however not much of an improvement for 2K gaming when it comes comparing to the 5800X3D. When you compare it to the 5800X3D, yes, it's an improvement. However, especially when you're looking at the 1% low, that's nearly a 20% improvement. However, what you need to really keep in mind here is when you're upgrading from the 5800X3D to a 9800X3D, you're not just looking at the motherboard, you're also looking at RAMs, you're looking at the CPU, you're looking at a whole new computer. Hopefully you'll just get a case as well, because they're not much of a difference. Looking at the Ultra 9 and Ultra 7, I'm not too impressed by them for 2K gaming, but keep in mind the Ultra 9 is really good. The Ultra 9 is really good when it comes to other tasks such as compression and decompression and all this video editing and all this stuff. So if you're into that stuff, yes, it does make sense to go for the Ultra 9. However, then again, the 9950X is quite good as well. The Ultra 9 is a tiny bit cheaper, but the Ultra 7 is behind these two processors. So if you're looking at a gaming / content creating, with content creating being your main focus with 2K gaming, you can go for the Ultra 9 or the 9950X. But if you want the latest and greatest and you're leaning more towards gaming and less towards content creation, then I'll go the 9800X3D. But if you're going just purely for gaming, I would really consider, especially if you're on the AM4 motherboard, I'd consider 5800X3D any day. Let's move on to 4K gaming, which is where we can see that it's a complete bottleneck by the GPU. The difference between all the CPUs are 3 frames of an average, and the 1% lows is 7 frames of an average. So the Core Ultra 9 and Core Ultra 7 are at 55 1% low, both of them, and the highest one is 63 with the 9800X3D. The 5800X3D and 7800X3D are nearly on par with 59 1% low and 60, and you've got the 9950 at 58 1% low. That's basically it, guys. Let's move on to the cost per frame for average frames, and then I'll do the cost per frame for 1% lows, and then we'll move on to my verdict. Now looking at this, you've got the 9800X3D quite high, especially when you're looking at 4K or 2K gaming. Where it does make sense is it shines a bit more is at full HD, which is the pink one over here. So over here there's not much of a difference. There's $1 there movement between the. However, if you're getting these CPUs, you're probably not going to be gaming at full HD. You're probably at least going at 2K, and at 2K immediately there's a price jump, and at 4K there's a massive difference between these two. There's a $4 difference between these two, and even the 7800X3Ds there. Looking at anything else for gaming, they're quite high. The Ultra is not bad at all, but it is lower cost than a 7800X3D. But if you're getting the 7800X3D, AMD is saying that they will be future-proofing the AM5 motherboard for at least 3 generations. So you might get another generation out of your AM5 motherboard before it becomes obsolete like the AM4 motherboard. Now the good thing about AMD as a company is they will keep providing support and new versions for the AM4, AM5. They're still bringing out new CPUs for the AM4 platform. So if you go onto the AM5 platform and you look for upgrades, you will be pretty good for a few more years at least with the latest and greatest of the next generation. But also you never know what they'll do. They might keep releasing stuff for it even after that. So that's the good thing. Whereas Intel, they generally have a 2-generation policy. So 2 generation on one motherboard, they change the pins and then you have to change your motherboard. So looking at that, I would highly recommend for gaming, just gaming, the 5800X3D. However, if you're looking at some content creation and you've got a bit more to spend, I would really consider the 9800X3D. It is the king in gaming, but not so much in all the content creation stuff. I would stay away from the Ultra 9 and 9950X. They're just purely for content creators. So if you're creating content, and the prices that I got for them are massive as well. So the 9950X I had was 1,029. That's the cheapest. Whereas the 5800X3D, I got the price for it was $519 ish. So the price for the 5800X3D I got was for $519. That's the cheapest. The 7800X3D I got $709. The 9800X3D I got nearly $900 was the cheapest. And the Ultra was quite high. The 9 1004, and the Ultra 7 was $619. So AMD is taking a really smart path by actually dividing and segregating between their content creation and gaming CPUs. So it's either or, so you can't really lose out with AMD. Whereas, and both of them are AM5 chips, so they can go on the same motherboard, whereas Intel is trying to do both, which makes their life a little bit harder. So last slide I have for you guys is the 1% lows. So looking at the 1% lows, you'll again see the same sort of scenario, whereas there's not much at full HD. Yes, the value is still quite a bit there for the 5800X3D, actually more value for full HD in 1% lows than average. So that's telling you a bit, and a lot more value when we go to 4K. Now, looking at these stats here, I'll let you guys read it for yourself, but just looking at the value for money, I would take the 5800X3D any day. However, knowing the new GPUs, especially the RTX 5090, that's going to be a powerhouse. I would not want a lot of stuttering to happen. I do look at the 1% lows, but there's also the 0.1% lows as well, which introduces stuttering. So I have seen a guy by the name of, I think, Michael Owens or something like that. He's got a channel and he had a beautiful video on how even 9800X3D paired up with the RTX 4090 still had some stuttering in the newest Star Wars games, but that can be optimization as well. So it can't just purely be that, but it's a good video to see. So based on this, if you have money to spend, if you don't have a system and you're looking for gaming mostly, then I'll get the 9800X3D within a heartbeat. If you've got the 5800X3D, I'll sit it out. I am personally sitting it out just because of the value for money, and because AMD I know will have one more CPU in this generation, then they'll be moving on to a new motherboard. So if they do that, I might skip the next generation again, depending on how much of a value it is and how good it is. The 9800X3D, don't get me wrong, is quite an improvement, but not enough. So I needed to see more for the value to make sense, you know what I mean? So it costs a lot more. So they've increased the performance, but the cost has increased much more than the performance. So that's why this value is so high. And the 5800X3D, I've already got it. I've got the RAMs, I've got everything. I've got 64 gigs of RAMs at 400 megahertz. I'm quite happy with my personal rig as that. Now I will be working on a 5090 video and a 5080 video, so hang in there guys. Comment below which one would you go for. What do you think about my evaluation? I personally think the Ultra 9 is a kind of good processor if you're looking to do some gaming on the side, but so is the 9950X. The Ultra 7 is an okay processor, but it really struggles with content creation, and it really doesn't have that much value when it comes to gaming. The 7800 XT has better value when it comes to gaming, in my opinion, and the 7800 X3D is also pretty good with content creation when compared to the Ultra 7. So that's basically my opinion, guys. Thank you so much for watching to the end. Make sure you like this video, subscribe if you can. Take good care. Bye bye.